The North Atlantic, a moonless night, early 1941. The sea is not black, but a vast, ink-washed gray, merging seamlessly with a cloud. Choked sky, there is no horizon, only the deep, resonant sigh of the ocean and the hiss of wind across steel. From the depths, a shadow breaks the surface. It is silent, sudden, a violation of the empty seascape. Seawater cascades from its casing in torrents. The conning tower of *U. 556 emerges, a slick, dark fin against the gloom. A hatch clangs open, cold, salt-tinged. Air floods into the fetid interior below. Captain Lieutenant Herbert Wolfarth ascends, his lungs gulping the fresh night. He scans the impenetrable darkness, nothing, to his lookouts posted port and starboard. The world is a void, they are blind, but so is the enemy. This is their domain, their sanctuary. The diesel engines rumble to life, a deep-throated growl charging batteries and pushing the boat forward at cruising speed. Below, radioman Heinz Brandt listens intently to the encrypted chatter from BDU U-boat command. A convoy is near, the pack is gathering. On the surface, they are hunters, lethal and invisible. The night is their greatest ally. It wraps around them like a cloak. They feel, for these few hours, untouchable. But above that same featureless ocean, a different sound thrums, a distant, persistent drone muffled by cloud and wind, unheard, unseen, an aircraft, its crew peering into an oscilloscope, watching for a faint, greenish ghost of a return signal. The U-boat's impunity is an illusion, and it is about to be shattered by light. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a single engagement, but a relentless 6-year campaign of attrition waged across the world's most unforgiving ocean. It was a siege where the United Kingdom's lifeline, the merchant convoys from North America, carrying food, fuel, and materiel, was the prize. To strangle that lifeline was the singular strategic objective of Nazi Germany's Kriegsmarine, and its most potent weapon was the Unterseeboot, the U-boat. From the first hours of the war, with the sinking of the passenger liner Assinia by *U. 30 on September 3, 1939, the threat was unambiguous. The early U-boats, primarily the Type VII, were not true submarines in the modern sense. They were submersible torpedo boats. Their diesels, which provided high surface speed and unlimited range, required air. Their electric batteries for submerged propulsion were limited, granting only a few hours at slow speed before needing a recharge. A U-boat's lethality and its survival depended on its ability to spend the majority of its time on the surface. This vulnerability was mitigated by geography and technology. The Atlantic, vast and often storm-tossed, provided an ocean of hiding places. Early in the war, Allied escort vessels were few, their range limited, and their detection capabilities primitive. Against this, Admiral Karl Dönitz, the mastermind of the U-boat arm, perfected his Rudel tactic. The Wolfpack, instead of lone hunters operating on a search-and-destroy basis, U-boats were directed by radio from his headquarters in Lorient, France, to form patrol lines across suspected convoy routes. A single boat making visual contact would shadow the convoy, broadcasting homing signals. The pack would converge under cover of darkness, surface, and attack en masse from within the convoy's columns, creating a chaotic slaughter that overwhelmed the escorts. The period from the summer of 1940 to the end of 1941 became known to U-boat crews as Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. With the fall of France, U-boats gained direct access to the Atlantic from bases like Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire, slashing transit times. Allied shipping losses skyrocketed. In October 1940 alone, Wolfpack sank over 60 ships. Convoys SC-7 and HX-79 that same month suffered catastrophic losses in a single night attack. The U-boat seemed an unstoppable predator. The ocean was dark. The hunter had the advantage of surprise, and the night was his shield. But that shield was not impervious. It was about to be challenged by the first, faltering steps of a new science. The Allied response to the U-boat menace was a desperate, multifaceted scramble. It was a war fought not just with depth charges and cannons, but with slide rules. Cathode ray tubes and encrypted signals. The first layer of defense was the convoy system itself, a centuries-old tactic that concentrated targets, but also concentrated escorts, corvettes, frigates, and destroyers, often manned by reservists and volunteers. From across the Commonwealth, formed a thin gray line around the precious merchantmen. Their primary weapon was the depth charge, a crude but terrifying barrel of high explosives set to detonate at a specific depth. Its effectiveness was minimal without accurate target data. Initial detection relied on the ASDIC, or sonar, as the Americans called it, a device that sent out a ping of sound waves and listened for an echo from a submerged hull. It was revolutionary but fatally flawed. It could not detect a vessel. The surface, and a skilled U-boat captain, hearing the ping, could maneuver to avoid the firing angle or dive deep into the ocean's thermal layers, disappearing from the scope. The aircraft, however, posed a different threat. From the first days of the war, RAF coastal command patrols flew over coastal waters. A surfaced U-boat sighted daylight was extremely vulnerable to a sudden attack with machine guns, bombs, or later rocket projectiles. The mere presence of aircraft forced U-boats to submerge, breaking their contact with convoys and slowing their operational speed to a crawl. This was the genesis of the critical concept: if you could find the U-boat, you could suppress or kill it. The breakthrough for night and overcast conditions seemed to arrive with the invention of air-to-surface vessel radar, or ASV. The ASV MK-II, fitted to aircraft from 1940 onwards, could detect a large ship at up to 40 miles and a surfaced U-boat's conning tower at perhaps 8 to 10 miles. In principle, it was the perfect solution. An aircraft could now see through cloud and darkness, guiding itself toward a target invisible to the human eye. In practice, it created a new, maddening problem. The radar's range was greater than the visual range on a dark night. A pilot would receive a strong, promising blip on his oscilloscope, navigate toward it through the black void, and then the blip would fade. As he got closer, the final critical mile was a blind approach. By the time the U-boat was a dark shape against the dark sea, it was often too late. The aircraft would roar overhead, the U-boat would crash dive in a panic of swirling water, and the attack would fail. The hunter had been announced by an electronic whisper, granting its prey just enough time to vanish. The night, even when pierced by radar, still belonged to the U-boat. The Atlantic Gap, the stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft, remained a slaughterhouse. The tactical equation was clear and frustratingly balanced. Radar could find, but without light, it could not finalize the kill. What was needed was a bridge between the electronic eye and the human one, a way to turn the last seconds of a radar approach into a moment of stark, inescapable revelation. This precise technical and operational dilemma was already occupying the mind of a quiet, determined squadron leader, working not in a grand military laboratory, but in a hotel room on England's south coast. For the 45 men crammed inside a Type VII U-boat, life was divided into two starkly different realities. Submerged, it was a world of constant tension. The air grew thick with the smells of diesel oil, sweat, and stale food. Condensation dripped from cold steel hull plates, every creak of the pressure hull, every ping of an unseen Allied sonar tightened the chest. Men spoke in hushed tones, moving with deliberate care to conserve battery power. They were blind, slow, and vulnerable. Surfacing after dark was a moment of profound, almost physical relief. The hatches opened, the roar of the diesel blowers scoured the boat with fresh, cold Atlantic air. Men scrambled to the bridge for their watch, their eyes straining to adjust to the immense star-strewn blackness. Below, the chief engineer monitored his gauges as the powerful man diesels roared, gulping air and voraciously charging the batteries that were the boat's submerged lifeblood. On the bridge, the lookouts began their endless hypnotic scan, each man responsible for a slice of horizon. They knew the penalty for a lapse in concentration was not a reprimand, but a sudden plume of water from a destroyer's shell or the silhouette of an aircraft against the clouds. This nightly ritual was a calculated risk, a necessity that became a psychological crutch. The darkness was their ally. Human vision, even with excellent night adaptation, was limited to a few thousand yards at best, the low, gray silhouette of a U-boat conning tower was virtually invisible against the chaotic patterns of the night sea. They felt a sense of security, even invincibility, in this void. The only threat was a chance, close range visual sighting by an enemy vessel, a rare occurrence. They could see the distant glow of a convoy's smoking funnels long before the convoy could see them. They were the watchers in the dark. This routine bred a specific kind of alertness. Ears became as important as eyes. The watch listened for the distant thrum of a ship's engines, the distinctive beat of a corvette's propellers, but above all, they listened for one sound, the drone of an aircraft engine. It was the one threat that could materialize with terrifying speed. The protocol was drilled into them. At the first faint suspicion of an aircraft sound, the alarm would be sounded and the boat would crash dive in under 30 seconds. But on a windy night, with the diesels roaring and the sea slapping the hull, that sound was easily masked. Their safety, therefore, resided in the sheer improbability of an aircraft finding this tiny speck of steel in a million square miles of black ocean. It was a gamble they took every night. And for years, the odds were overwhelmingly in their favor. The night was not just a condition, it was their armor. For the aircrews of RAF Coastal Command, the war was fought in a realm of profound sensory deprivation. Their aircraft, the lumbering, long-range Consolidated Liberator, the stalwart short Sunderland flying boat, the adaptable Vickers Wellington, became capsules of noise and tension suspended between a starless sky and an ink-black sea. Missions lasted 12, 14, sometimes 18 hours. Crews endured numbing cold, the constant roar of engines, and the strain of peering into an abyss that offered no reference points. Their primary instrument of hope was the ASV radar screen. The radar operator, hunched over his flickering green oscilloscope in a darkened cabin, was the crew's soul. Linked to the unseen world below, his was a world of abstract geometry, sweep lines rotated, painting the electronic landscape. A merchant convoy might appear as a cluster of pulsing blips, a single, isolated echo, sharp and distinct, moving against the sea. Return, that was the prize, that was a U-boat. From that moment, a carefully rehearsed but deeply fraught ballet began. The pilot would alter course, guided by the operator's calm directions. Echo bearing 27. 0, range 4 miles, closing 3 miles, 2 miles. The tension in the aircraft would ratchet higher. The bomb aimer would move to the nose, his hands on the release controls. Every man would stare into the darkness ahead, willing a shape to materialize from the void. And then invariably the call from the radar operator, echo fading, losing contact at 1 mile. The blip would dissolve into the general clutter of the sea's radar return. They had entered the blind zone. The radar's minimum range was greater than their visual range. The pilot would push forward on the control column, descending to 50 feet. See a dark blur beneath them. They would sweep the area, hearts pounding, knowing the U-boat was right there, perhaps just a few hundred yards away, itself blind and unaware, but without a visual fix. They were helpless. The U-boat, having heard their engines at the last moment, would be in a frantic crash dive. All they might see was a fleeting patch of white water, a fading swirl of phosphorescence where the boat had been. The frustration was visceral, a compound of exhaustion, adrenaline, and defeat. They had outwitted the ocean with technology, only to be thwarted by the final impenetrable curtain of night. They returned to base with their depth charges or bombs still racked, their reports speaking of probable submergence or attack foiled by loss of contact. The enemy remained safe in the knowledge that the night's cloak, though it could be ruffled, could not be torn away. This cycle of near success and ultimate failure defined their war. It was a problem that demanded not just better radar, but a way to deliver a single, paralyzing moment of Clarity in that last, critical second of the approach, a moment that would shift the advantage irrevocably from the hunted to the hunter. The problem, stripped to its technical core, was one of brutal simplicity and immense difficulty. How do you illuminate a small, moving target in the middle of a dark ocean? From a moving aircraft, with enough intensity and precision to permit a lethal attack, all within the span of seconds. The men tasked with solving this were not just military officers, but practical engineers and scientists working under the pressure of imminent national collapse. At the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, and within Coastal Command itself, the parameters of the puzzle were clear. The existing airborne searchlights, designed for illuminating large ground targets or aiding in landing, were useless. They were too weak. Their beams too diffuse. Switching on a standard light from a mile out would merely give the U-boat a glaring beacon to aim at and dive away from. The solution had to be integrated with the ASV radar. The sequence was logical. Radar detects, radar guides, light illuminates, attack follows, but the handoff from electronic to visual was the critical phase. The light needed to be triggered automatically and at the exact moment the target entered visual range, ideally when the aircraft was already in its final attack run, committed and aligned. The challenges were manifold. First, the lamp itself. It required a bulb of extraordinary power in the realm of 20 million candela, hundreds of times brighter than a standard aircraft landing light. It needed a parabolic reflector of precise design to focus that stupendous output into a tight, penetrating beam, not a wide wash of light. This generated immense heat, requiring forced air cooling. The entire assembly, lamp, reflector, cooling system, became a heavy, bulky unit that had to be mounted externally on an aircraft already laden with radar, weapons, and fuel. Second, the deployment mechanism. The assembly couldn't create drag during normal flight. It had to be retractable, stowed within the aircraft's hull or a specially fitted fairing and then extended into the airstream seconds before use. This demanded robust hydraulics or electric motors that would not fail in the salt-laden, vibrating environment of a low-flying bomber. Third, and most critically, the firing circuit. This was the synapse of the entire system. It had to be slaved to the radar set as the pilot descended on his final run, guided by the radar operator's calls. The radar's own minimum range blind spot was the trigger. The system was designed so that the moment the radar lost the target echo, meaning the aircraft had flown over this hill of the radar beam's cone, and the U-boat was now directly ahead and slightly below, a contact switch would close. This automatically lowered the light and a heartbeat later ignited it. The timing was everything. From light on to bomb release needed to be under 5 seconds. The pilot, momentarily night blind from the cockpit darkness, would be confronted with a sudden, shocking vision, a gray-white U-boat frozen in the brilliant circle of light, its crew caught in mid-action like insects in amber. There would be no time for evasion. It was a solution of terrifying elegance, using the radar's moment of failure as the weapon's moment of activation. The man who doggedly championed this integrated system was not a high-ranking admiral or a famed scientist, but a 39-year-old wing commander in Coastal Command, a man driven by operational necessity and sheer persistence. Humphrey de Verde lay for the men at the pinnacle of command, Admiral Karl Dönitz in his concrete headquarters at Countermeasures, and across the Channel, the First Sea Lord in the Admiralty's citadel in London. The Battle of the Atlantic was reduced to a chillingly simple equation. It was a race of tonnage, sink more ships than the Allies could build, and Britain would starve. Every week, teams of analysts plotted 2 lines on a graph. 1. Tracked Allied merchant shipping losses, measured in gross registered tons. The other tracked new construction from American and Canadian shipyards. For Dönitz, the numbers of late 1941 and early 1942 were promising. His U-boat fleet was expanding. American entry into the war had given him a rich new hunting ground. Off its eastern seaboard, a second happy time, the sheer volume of the Atlantic, remained his greatest asset. He calculated that if he could maintain a force of over 300 operational U-boats at sea, the sinkings would outpace production indefinitely. The convoy system was an annoyance, not a deterrent. The night surface attack was his winning tactic. His confidence was rooted in a fundamental belief: technology might shift, but the elemental vastness and darkness of the ocean would always favor the discreet, patient hunter. In London, the graph told a different story. The lines were converging in a way that promised catastrophe. The lifeline was fraying. Each sunken ship was not just a statistic. It was thousands of tons of wheat that would never become bread, tanks that would never reach Egypt, aviation fuel that would never power Spitfires. The pressure on the Royal Navy and RAF Coastal Command was immense and unrelenting. Politicians demanded results. Winston Churchill himself would later write that the U-boat threat was the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war. For Air Chief Marshal Sir Philip Joubert de la Ferté, appointed Commander-in-Chief of Coastal Command in 1941, the problem was operational and technological. He knew his crews were brave and skilled. He knew the radar was a breakthrough, but he also saw the stark reports: radar contact lost at 1 mile, no visual, U-boat presumed submerged. The gap between detection and destruction was a chasm that was costing the war. He became a vocal advocate for any innovation that could close that gap. He's encouraged experimental units, backed risky modifications, and demanded that the ministry prioritize the needs of his command. In this environment, an unsolicited proposal from a persistent wing commander for a high-powered, radar-linked searchlight was not dismissed as a distraction. It was a potential lifeline. The operational commander's view was one of grim necessity. Winning the campaign required not just courage but a tool that could transform those nightly near misses into certain kills. The strategic survival of the West depended on solving a tactical problem of light. The idea did not emerge from a top-secret research bureau, but from the frustrated mind of a serving officer. Wing Commander Humphrey de Verde Lee, a World War I pilot turned peacetime police officer and later a coastal command station commander, was a practical man. Watching his returning crews debrief, he was struck by the same maddening refrain: "We had him on the radar, but we lost him in the dark." To Lee, the solution was obvious. If you couldn't see in the dark, you had to bring your own light. In 1940, operating almost as a private inventor, he began sketching. His concept was specific: a searchlight of unprecedented power, mounted in a retractable turret, slaved directly to the aircraft's ASV radar. He faced immediate skepticism. The Air Ministry's Directorate of Scientific Research saw it as a crude, heavy, and potentially dangerous addition that would compromise an aircraft's performance. Critics argued it would simply warn U-boats, but Lee possessed the stubbornness of the truly convinced. Using his own funds and leveraging personal connections, he had a prototype built by the Hudswell Clark Company in 1941, a 24-inch diameter searchlight with a 22 million candle power arc lamp. The breakthrough came with support from the top. Air Chief Marshal Joubert, desperate for any edge, saw potential where others saw folly. He authorized a formal trial. In December 1941, a modified Vickers Wellington bomber, its belly marred by a protruding fairing housing, Leigh Light, took to the air. The tests were promising but revealed critical flaws. The hydraulic deployment was slow. The light switch operated manually by the pilot was one step too many in the frantic attack sequence. Lee and the engineers at TRE worked relentlessly to refine it. The key innovation was the automatic firing circuit linked directly to the radar set. The system was rehoused in a streamlined, retractable tub that extended from the aircraft's belly, or in later installations, mounted in the place of a dorsal turret. By early June 1942, a small number of Wellington Mark VIII aircraft of No. 172 Squadron, based at RAF Chivener in Devon, were equipped with the new integrated system. The The crews called it simply the Leigh Light. The stage was set, the night of June 3-4, 1942, in the Bay of Biscay, the main transit route for U-boats to and from their French bases. A Leigh Light Wellington piloted by Squadron Leader J.H. Jimmy Gresswell was on patrol. The ASV operator picked up a contact. The routine began, the steady calls, the descent, the throttling back to reduce engine noise. This time, however, the procedure was different, as the radar return faded. At the 1-mile point, Gresswell didn't strain his eyes into the void. Instead, there was a whir of motors as the tub extended. A second later, the world outside his windscreen was transformed. A blinding sword of white light slashed down, piercing the darkness. Its center was not empty sea. There, caught in stark, merciless illumination, was U-502 a Type IXC boat. Fully surfaced, its deck awash. German sailors froze, their night vision obliterated, staring up at the sudden sun that had descended upon them. For Gresswell and his crew, the shock was equal but opposite. After hundreds of hours of chasing ghosts, they were finally seeing the enemy. There was no panic, only a smooth, trained response. The Wellington held steady. Depth charges tumbled from its racks. The explosions erupted alongside the U-boat's hull. U-502 with all 52 hands, vanished into the very darkness it had relied upon. The first confirmed Leigh Light kill was not just a victory, it was a revelation. The night was no longer a sanctuary, it had become a trap. The success of June 1942 was not an isolated incident. It was a proof of concept that ignited a rapid and ruthless program of expansion. Number 172 Squadron became a dedicated Leigh Light unit, its Wellingtons prowling the Bay of Biscay transit routes with impunity. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was immediate and profound. The fundamental rhythm of their existence, the safe, recharging hours on the surface under stars, was shattered. Now, the sound of distant aircraft engines carried a new and specific terror. It was no longer just the threat of a chance visual sighting, it was the anticipation of an apocalyptic moment when the black sky would suddenly ignite, pinning them in a circle of unbearable light from which there was no escape. The technical evolution was swift. The early systems, fitted to twin-engine Wickers, Wellingtons and Halifaxes, were effective in the constrained airspace of the bay, but to close the Atlantic gap, the system needed to be carried by very long-range VLR aircraft. The consolidated Liberator B-24, with its immense fuel capacity and heavy payload, was the ideal platform. Engineers fitted the Leigh Light in a retractable housing in the aircraft's forward bomb bay or in a streamlined nacelle under the wing. These aircraft, operating from bases in Northern Ireland, Iceland, and eventually the Azores, could now patrol the furthest reaches of the convoy routes, their endurance marrying with the new technology to deny the U-boats any safe haven. The tactical doctrine evolved with the hardware. Leigh Light aircraft often worked in concert with radar-equipped but unilluminated attackers. A marker aircraft would make the initial radar contact and guide in a killer aircraft fitted with the light. The U-boat, hearing the first aircraft and diving, would believe itself safe, as it resurfaced later. To recharge, the Leigh Light killer, lying in wait, would pounce. The Germans dubbed this terrifying new threat Die Unheimlich Licht, the uncanny light. Admiral Dönitz and his staff scrambled to counter this devastating blow. They developed the WAN's radar detector, an early warning receiver tuned to the specific frequency of the Allied ASV MK-II radar. For a time it worked. U-boat lookouts, alerted by the WAN's buzz, would crash dive before the aircraft could close to Leigh Light range. The sinkings dipped, but it was a fleeting respite. In early 1943, the Allies introduced their own revolution, centimetric radar. The ASV MK-II, operating on a wavelength of 10 cm, was invisible to the German detectors. Its beam was sharper, its definition finer. Now, the Leigh Light aircraft could approach in complete electronic silence. The first warning a U-boat crew had was no longer the buzz of a detector, but the deafening roar of low-flying engines, and the world erupting into blinding white. The climax of this technological duel was not a single battle, but a season of unrelenting attrition. Spring 1943 in the North Atlantic became the crucible, Leigh Light Liberators. And Halifax's, now equipped with the undetectable centimetric radar, worked in seamless union with surface escort groups, bolstered by support carrier groups, and guided by Huff-Duff intelligence, the U-boats were caught in a vice, surfacing to charge batteries or maintain speed with a convoy meant exposure to aircraft that could find them electronically and illuminate them physically. Submerging meant losing contact and falling hopelessly behind. The turning point was absolute. The hunter had become the hunted. The dark cloak that had granted the U-boat its power was, strand by electronic and photonic strand, being torn away. The sanctuary of the night was irrevocably violated, and with it collapsed the entire tactical foundation of Dernitz's tonnage war. The statistics tell a stark, unemotional story, but behind each number was a vessel of shattered steel and broken men. In the months following the widespread deployment of the Leigh Light coupled with centimetric radar, U-boat losses soared to unsustainable levels in the critical battles of the convoy routes in March, April, and May of 1943. The figures became apocalyptic for the Kriegsmarine. May 1943 alone, forever known in U-boat commands as Schwarzer Mai, Black May, saw 41 U-boats sent to the bottom in the Atlantic. For the first time in the war, U-boat losses outstripped new construction. The ratio of merchant ships sunk per U-boat lost, once comfortably in Germany's favor, plummeted. But the true aftermath was measured not just in sunk hulls, but in eroded will. The morale of the U-boat arm, once an elite force brimming with confident aggression, cracked under the strain of the Leigh Light. Survivors' reports, intercepted signals, and prisoner interrogations painted a consistent picture of a force gripped by a new kind of dread. The psychologist at BDU noted a sharp rise in cases of nervous exhaustion. Crews returning from patrols spoke in hollow tones of the unbearable tension. Every surface watch became an exercise in paranoid listening. The comforting darkness was now a source of anxiety, every patch of starless sky a potential source of the dreaded light. The tactical impact was immediate and drastic. Dernitz was forced to issue new restrictive orders. The direct transit routes across the Bay of Biscay became too deadly. U-boats were ordered to cross submerged by day, a crawl that drastically extended their voyage times and reduced their effective patrol periods. They were instructed to surface only briefly at night under strict radio silence, to snort using the Schnorchel air mast, which was now being hurriedly fitted, or to charge batteries in brief, frantic bursts. The Rudel tactic, which relied on constant radio communication and coordinated surface movement, became impossible to execute against convoys protected by aircraft equipped with Leigh Lights and centimetric radar. The technological countermeasures were desperate and too late. The Wands detector was rendered obsolete overnight by the new radar. The Schnorchel allowed a boat to run its diesels while just submerged, but it was a fragile device, prone to failure, and its use created a visible wake and reduced speed. The introduction of the Aphrodite radar, decoy balloon, or the Pillenwerfer submarine bubble target were mere tricks, attempts to confuse rather than overcome. They were the gestures of a force that had lost the initiative. The U-boat was no longer the stalker in the shadows. It had become a fugitive, clinging to the last remnants of its once complete concealment, knowing that a single mistake, a single moment on the surface, could mean being fixed in that terrible, final glare. The immediate toll was thus a double defeat, a catastrophic loss of material, and a fundamental breaking of the offensive spirit that had defined the U-boat service. The Atlantic, for a time, was no longer a German hunting ground. It had become a graveyard. The operational retreat from the North Atlantic in May 1943 was not a temporary tactical adjustment. It was a strategic admission of defeat. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Dönitz issued the order that signified the end of an era. He withdrew the wolf packs from the main convoy routes of the North Atlantic, the tonnage war, the core of his strategy. To strangle Britain was effectively over. The Leigh Light did not win the Battle of the Atlantic alone. It was part of a synergistic system that included centimetric radar, Duff improved depth charges, escort carrier groups, and Allied code-breaking, but it played the most visually and psychologically decisive role in breaking the back of the surface night attack. The consequences of this shift were immediate and profound on the Allied side. The graph lines in London finally crossed in the right direction. Merchant shipping losses plummeted. New construction from the Liberty ship programs began to flood in. Unchecked, the secure flow of men and materiel across the Atlantic became the unshakable foundation for every subsequent Allied operation. The invasion of Sicily, the landings at Salerno and Anzio, and ultimately the vast armada for Normandy. The United States became not just an arsenal, but a secure reservoir that could be tapped at will. The fear of starvation and industrial collapse that had haunted Whitehall since 1940 finally lifted. For the Kriegsmarine, the aftermath was a long, grim descent into technological irrelevance and sacrificial warfare, denied the rich hunting grounds of the main convoy. Lanes, U-boats were dispersed to peripheral and less profitable areas, the Indian Ocean, the South Atlantic, the Caribbean. They adopted increasingly defensive technologies like the Schnorchel, which made them slower, less effective, and miserable for their crews, but essential for survival. The later Type XXI Electroboot, true submarines designed to operate underwater for extended periods, were a direct response to the Allied air threat. But they arrived too late and in too few numbers to alter the course of the war. The U-boat arm continued to fight and continued to sink ships until the final days of the war, but it was no longer a strategic threat. It was a fleet of harassers, a nuisance that could still draw blood but could not dictate terms. The confidence that had characterized Dönitz's early war communiques was gone, replaced by a stubborn, fatalistic determination. The men who sailed after Black May were not the confident hunters of the happy time. They were doomed men executing a failed strategy, acutely aware that their primary mission was no longer victory, but simply to tie down Allied resources for as long as possible. The Leigh Light's legacy in the aftermath is captured in a simple, telling metric: the dramatic increase in U-boat kills by aircraft. Before its introduction, aircraft were a menace but a manageable one. After its integration with centimetric radar, aircraft became the primary killer of U-boats for the remainder of the war. It transformed the very nature of anti-submarine warfare from a defensive, reactive struggle to a proactive hunting discipline. The hunter had been forced to become the prey, not by a more powerful weapon, but by a simple beam of light that had forever changed the meaning of darkness. The Leigh Light was not the most complex weapon of the Second World War. It was not a nuclear fission device, a ballistic missile, or a digital computer. It was, in essence, modified naval searchlight fitted to an aircraft. Its genius lay not in its intrinsic complexity, but in its perfect pragmatic application. It solved a specific, maddening problem at the precise intersection of human limitation and technological potential. It bridged the final, fatal gap between seeing and knowing. Its story is a testament to the power of iterative ingenuity under pressure. It was championed not by a committee of senior scientists, but by a practical-minded officer who understood the visceral frustration of his crews. Its development was a fight against institutional skepticism, a battle won by demonstrable results in the unforgiving laboratory of the North Atlantic night. The Leigh Light did not operate in a vacuum. Its true potency was unlocked only when married to the silent, invisible eye of centimetric radar. This union, the undetectable electronic finder and the devastating visual revealer, created a system greater than the sum of its parts, a 1-2 punch that shattered a tactical paradigm. For the U-boat crews, the legacy of the Leigh Light is one of a fundamental rupture in the natural order of their war. It transformed the ocean's eternal darkness from a shield into a source of profound vulnerability. It replaced the anxiety of the unknown with the certainty of a terrifying revelation. The light did not just illuminate a steel hull, it exposed the fragility of an entire strategy built on concealment. In the broader sweep of history, the Leigh Light symbolizes a pivotal moment when the balance of the Battle of the Atlantic tipped irrevocably. It helped secure the lifeline that fueled the Allied liberation of Europe, but perhaps its most enduring lesson is a timeless one: that in conflict, advantage is often conditional. The U-boat's dominion was granted by the night, and all it took to reclaim that dominion was a determined mind, a brilliant engineer, and the courage to switch on a light, turning the hunter's greatest ally into the field of his ultimate defeat. The war in the Atlantic, a struggle measured in millions of tons and thousands of lives, was ultimately altered by a single, piercing beam, proving that sometimes the most decisive weapon is the one that simply lets you see.